Welcome to Understanding Youth Homelessness presented by YCD. My name is Reem Saeed, and I'm one of the co-chairs for YCD Colorado Student Board. And today we will be discussing youth homelessness with some amazing individuals. But first, I want to introduce YCD. YCD's mission is that we believe that education is a fundamental human right and one of the critical tools every young person needs to succeed in life. We believe that change must come from within a community and not from outside forces. We're working towards a more just and equitable society that values every human being. We believe in the young people who lead us to this vision. And with that, I will be emceeing this webinar, but I'd love the other panelists to introduce themselves.
I guess I'll start us off. Hi, everybody. My name is Michael D. Davis Thomas. I'm from Michigan. Spent a little bit of 11 years in the Michigan child welfare system, 5 on the juvenile, 5 in foster care. Spent a little bit over 5 years in a state of homelessness myself and working my way out of it. So glad to be here today to share my insight and my knowledge and my experience.
Awesome. Yeah, my name is Austin Doyle. I'm the Support Services Supervisor at Urban Peak, Denver. We serve youth 14 to 24 that are experiencing homelessness. So I oversee a team of education, employment, and social emotional services. I myself experienced homelessness throughout my childhood. I was in and out of the foster care system, and just excited to be here, and share some of my insight that I have to provide.
Yeah, hi, and my name is Maria Hardman. I am the education coordinator at Urban Peak in Denver. So I work closely with Austin every single day, doing GED, high school re-enrollment, going on to post-secondary, including trade school, and love to provide some insight into, the lives of our youth and kind of what we do every day at Urban Peak. So glad to be here.
Thank you all for being here. So I'll just ask you all a few questions and anyone can share out at any time. So first, I just wanted to ask you all about the term homeless, because in recent years, the term homeless and unhoused have been used almost interchangeably. So I just wanted to know if the two are the same, if one is better than the other, and what the difference between the two words were.
I'll start us off. For me, I personally believe in the category of homelessness, there's multiple different groups and what you can refer yourself as, so in the specific sense of homelessness or being unhoused, that could mean a variety of different things, because I think about my own personal situation. Altogether in the category, I was homeless, but could have been considered couch surfing. I could have been considered unhoused altogether, so there's different variations and different terms, depending on the person's comfortability and also depending on what kind of services you're trying to get, because for certain welfare services, when you are homeless, you can't put, well, I'm homeless, but I'm staying with somebody, so it really depends on, where you're at, what services you're trying to use, but also what you're comfortable with. But all in the same sense, I believe homelessness in itself is a category of type of living, not just one simple thing.
Yeah, definitely. Like I'll hop out on that. Like absolutely, Michael's definitely right. There's quite a few different definitions, like specifically for HUD versus the McKinney-Vento definition. They're different. Like couch surfing constitutes as homeless for McKinney-Vento, specifically with education, whereas with HUD it doesn't. But I absolutely think that it's definitely individualized, and so when we talk about the intersecting identities of a lot of the youth that we work with specifically here at Urban Peak, we certainly don't want to put that onto someone, and so we like to kind of use that similar like person first language. And so when we're working with youth, we approach it from a very individualized basis based on the needs that they have at that specific time, whether that be basic needs, employment, specifically with education. Certainly, that brings on a variety of different definitions of what some of our youth need. But kind of all in all, we like to look at it from a very, kind of youth-centric point of view.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Austin was saying, it's helpful for us, at least at Urban Peak, to be able to look at it in a more holistic fashion when we're looking at, the term homelessness and what that constitutes. It is a little bit difficult because we do have to abide by these different, definitions that HUD and everybody else sets, that can be, to be honest, they can be somewhat arbitrary in our day-to-day work, right? The things that we're doing every day, we're not necessarily asking, are you couch surfing versus are you camping in a tent on the sidewalk? We kind of have to meet the youth where they're at and provide the services that we're able to, based on how they're presenting to us. But it can be really difficult when you're working with all those different tricky definitions, for sure.
So Austin and Maria specifically talked about these definitions that they kind of have to abide by. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly. So, we work very closely, especially like Maria and our education team, with the McKinney-Vento. So for those of you that aren't familiar, McKinney-Vento is a federal act that provides safeguards for youth that are experiencing homelessness within the public education system. So our role typically is working with the liaisons, which every school district within the country, public school district, is required to have at least one liaison to help with any youth that is experiencing the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness. And so specifically with that can be a youth that, maybe couch surfing. So someone that may be disassociated from their family. They could be staying with a friend or someone like that, or a significant other, just not at their home. That could be someone that's staying, outdoors. So that kind of qualifies under the definition of literal homelessness. And so specifically with that, we typically will kind of take that on an individualized basis, and we will work with them to kind of help them re-access services. So those services could be access to transportation. So the school district's required to provide transportation for them. That could be basic needs. So like specifically with Denver Public School, they help provide basic needs gift cards. And then most specifically, the one that we find the most important is that extra support and the advocacy. So whether that be a youth that has, special education services that falls under an IEP or a 504, that could be a variety of different things, but that McKinney-Vento and what we do here at Urban Peak is help provide that advocacy for youth that don't, have that, whether that be a parent, a guardian. We get to serve as that educational surrogate to be able to, help advocate for, them to be able to even get to school or get the services that they need, whether, free or reduced lunches, things like that. And then I think Maria can probably add to that, as Maria does that, kind of on a daily basis.
Yeah, the McKinney-Vento, legislation has been absolutely critical for us because it allows us to just work so much more easily with the youth. We can do things like re-enroll like immediately, which is really, really cool. Sometimes we have schools that'll kind of put up resistance and they might not understand, and we're like, we can bring them back and say, no, this is actual legislation, this is federal law. You basically have to comply, which is great. So sometimes those definitions really do end up doing us some good. So, I'll take my hats off to that. But yeah, I think transportation, as Austin mentioned, is definitely one of the biggest pieces, one of the biggest challenges we run into with youth. Oftentimes, even though we are very centrally located, it's quite simple, quite easy for youth to be able to where they need to go from Urban Peak. We do find that still there is a struggle. And so I would say transportation is the biggest piece. McKinney-Vento does help us be able to get hop, skip, drive referrals. So with that, we're able to sometimes get a car pickup service from where the youth is to where they need to go in terms of school. And all that is definitely due to the McKinney-Vento legislation. So sometimes they do us good.
Yeah, so pivoting directions a little, I want to ask specifically about the foster care system and how that could lead to youth homelessness.
Well, I started this off because I know Austin and Maria mentioned, about homelessness for youth and, in a sense of being in school and different things like that. But also, we're living in a world where homelessness is actually happening in our child welfare system due to the lack of placements and people being in this middle ground of having to choose to have to go to congregate care or being held in juvenile facilities, but technically in the technical sense, when we think about homelessness, these are people who have had, for whatever reason, have been deemed unsafe to be at home or not having a parent to take care of them. So they've been in the care of that state. And unfortunately, due to the lack of foster homes or nurturing environments, they're stuck in this place of limbo, of homelessness inside of the foster care system. So first and foremost, I wanted to share that piece because that is happening across the nation and in different states because we don't have foster parents, especially more importantly for teenagers and so forth. So, but the other aspect of that is, we have a lot of youth who do come into care with heavy trauma, and not a lot of people really being trauma informed or really having an understanding of what it means to be a foster parent, and when I say that, I want to be clear, parenting, there's no real guide to it anyway, but when stepping into foster parent society doesn't really give us a clean slate, to visualize what it means to be a foster parent, so a lot of these people take on this duty and they realize that, this isn't where, they have the skills to do so, and that clear is placed over and over again, and it creates a cycle. And next thing you know, a kid has behavior issues, which ultimately makes it even more hard for that kid to be placed. So in the sense of foster care, there's many different variations, which I'm gonna leave some for Austin and Maria to share upon. But those are some of the things that I work around. I do a lot of work with 14 and up, preparing people in that transition age, and that's a lot of what I see far as what I do in my work.
Yeah, no, Mike absolutely nailed it, especially when we're talking about like the trauma informed piece to it. I mean, that's such an absolutely vital role is, kind of running into that continuity of care, working with people that are trauma informed because the reality of the situation is that most youth that are within the foster care system have experienced some form of trauma, within their lives in the past. And us specifically, we work a lot with Chafee, we work a lot with some of these other programs that are supposed to provide these safeguards for our youth that are accessing the foster care system, whether that be currently. And then for us at Urban Peak, we work with a lot of youth that have aged out of the foster care system between that kind of 18 to 22 years old, to where they're still receiving some of those services, some of those benefits that they get. The big piece that I see personally is you're kind of case processing with 6 or 7 different people, and so that can be very, very challenging for us because us at Urban Peak, we're trying to do a very specific thing, whether that be re-enroll a youth into school or help them find a job, making sure that they're getting their benefits, the federal benefits like SNAP, some of those, like their food stamps, things like that. What's very challenging for us is that we're having to go through 6 or 7 different people to make sure that our youth are getting the very basic needs. That in itself is such a challenge. And I'll let Maria talk a little bit more, being that Maria does more of that kind of like the kind of day-to-day care for that. But for me, kind of from that bigger picture standpoint, having to making sure that we're involving all these different people within that foster care system can be very, very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you both really hit the nail on the head with that one. The biggest piece for me that I see, especially with the foster care piece, as Austin mentioned, we do work with a lot of youth that have aged out of the foster care system, and it's really tough to see the youth try to make that transition, because sometimes it just really doesn't go all that well, and a lot of times that's why we end up seeing them at Urban Peak, because there isn't a lot of support and there aren't a lot of services to sort of help those youth go through that huge transition piece of aging out of foster care. But one of the biggest silver linings that I try to at least work with the youth on is, there are some regulations in place, and Austin can probably name exactly what they are, but youth in Colorado that have been in the foster care system past the age of 16 are eligible for free cost of living at community colleges in the state of Colorado. So that is a huge silver lining piece that I try to work with. It's really hard sometimes. We utilize a very trauma-informed approach at Urban Peak. So I'm not exactly walking up to every youth that I work with and going, hey, were you in foster care? But we try to build that rapport and work with them a little bit and glean what information we can. And it is really rewarding to work with some of the youth that have been through that harrowing experience and come out, and we can say, hey, not only can we get your tuition covered, we can get you rent, we can get you food, we can get you textbooks, and it's very rewarding in that sense. So I do appreciate the silver linings of it. And I apologize for my dog in the background as well.
Rima, if you don't mind me adding even just a little bit more to that piece, I found, at least in my state, I don't know if it's the same in Colorado, a lot of people are aging out nowadays and aging out straight into homelessness. We have like a lot of youth opportunity programs here in the state of Michigan and so forth, but unfortunately, like were given like the FYI vouchers, and so forth from HUD, but we were only allowed a certain amount, and only a certain amount went to certain counties. So for a state that has over 13,000 youth in care, a good percentage of those youth, I don't know the exact number, are aging out every year, and to only have 25 of those vouchers, being handed out, and then other ones, the other youth workers are reaching out to me as a peer support, as a resource, as an advocate. Hey, do you know of any good shelters for that person to go to? And just thinking about how that relates back to the youth, to know that, hey, I've been in the system all this time, and we sat in all these meetings to develop a plan. And at the end of it all, at 18, I'm aging out. There's nothing else for me, but to go to a homeless shelter. And unfortunately, in my state, that is the real reality, and as an advocate, that's something I've been working with to try to figure out how in my state we can make an exception with our local HUD or HUD in general in a federal sense, to be able to have youth that are 16 and they're looking at a permanency plan of aging out of the system, to be able to apply for those Section 8 vouchers, those HUD vouchers at 16 or 17, because these lists be 2 years or 3 years long, so they can at least have an opportunity or chance at a voucher. But also another thing with vouchers, all encompassing, is the fact that it's really hard for males to receive vouchers, more specifically, and not to throw any biases or what have you, but I don't know, I've only seen some of the young ladies that I work with that have kids receive these vouchers more so than a male or a single young lady.
Yeah, and just to piggyback of what all of you have said, I heard the term trauma informed a few times. So could you all explain what that is and how that relates to youth homelessness?
Yeah, I would love to jump in, and unfortunately I'm gonna have to hop off here in a second, and so just want to make sure I share this and then leave everything to Maria, because I know Maria is one of the best people to speak on anything as it pertains to this. But for me specifically, trauma informed, my goodness, it's such a widely used term kind of around the services that we provide here, as well as a lot of the support services throughout Denver, throughout Colorado. I'm sure just youth homelessness in general, but the way that we see it here is really just kind of approaching many situations, from a youth perspective, understanding that a lot of the youth that we've worked with have experienced trauma in the past. And so it's really meeting the youth where they're at. So, understanding that, when we're approaching each situation, that we're doing it, like I've said it a million times, but on an individualized basis. So understanding that, working with one youth, the 3 that may access the classroom in a single day, that each of those youth have experienced a different trauma, making sure that we're approaching that from an individualized basis, understanding that, we're going to have to approach these situations differently, recognizing that, we're going to have to put any biases aside, any of those things, and making sure that we're addressing basic needs first, making sure that, we're listening. But the biggest thing, in my opinion, is really just making sure that, we're just listening to youth, understanding what they need, and approaching it from a sense of, hey, like we understand, we're here to support, we're here to take, the trauma that you've had in the past, and we're here to really try to affect, to make sure that we can do what we have the ability to in the moment to truly make a difference, in their life, whether that be through education, through employment, really through any piece that we can provide. But what I will say, the caveat to that, I think, is that the term trauma informed, unfortunately, is thrown around just in a general sense. People kind of use that as a safeguard. And so we want to make sure that, people that use that word trauma informed are really kind of doing that research, using that professional development to really just kind of increase their craft. Not to say that I'm 100% an expert, but just really recognizing that that's something that, is an ever evolving piece, and that we're really trying to use on a daily basis. But to say, unfortunately, like I am going to have to step off, but Maria will share my information. And so I just want to make sure if anyone has any questions, anything like that, to please feel free to reach out to me, and really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share some of my experience with you all.
Thank you for being here.
Guess I'll pick up from there, when my perspective, trauma informed is really, looking at the individual's trauma in its entirety and from a holistic standpoint, and by doing it, really, understanding that behavior is language, and understanding the root and the methods between every piece of the story, and really just slowing things down. Being trauma informed helps as far as prevention and preservation in all aspects, whether that be with bio parents in a foster care sense, or whether that be with foster parents, or whether that be setting your own sense of family. So that's my shortened, view on what it means to be trauma informed and in that aspect. But I will also add, a lot of the work that I'm doing to really, create transformative change in the aspect of being trauma informed is really trying to make sure that not only are we trying to implement that with youth, with foster parents, with agencies, but implementing that with our legislators and our policymakers, so they are more trauma informed and more trauma conscious with them making these policies and bills that they're passing to be able to help in a sense of foster care and adoption and child welfare.
Yeah, I think Michael, really, that was great. I'd like to speak slightly, shift it a little bit and talk about how trauma-informed care really affects like the day-to-day working with youth, because that's my life. So it's been really great having this job, because approaching everything with a trauma-informed perspective, as Austin said, really allows us to meet the youth where they're at. And I'd like to bring in a little bit of, and maybe we'll get into this a little later as well, but I think trauma-informed care really goes hand in hand with harm reduction. And I think harm reduction is a huge piece of trauma-informed care that I've learned a lot about since I've been in this job, and just that's super important to me in general. And you know, harm reduction is specifically around like substance use has been huge. You know, trauma-informed care allows us to really just understand the youth where I know we say meet the youth where they're at, but just what that entails is sort of abandoning your own prejudices and your own preconceptions and your own potential understandings of what you think the way things should be, or what the way people should act and things like that. And abandoning those kind of preconceptions allows us to have a more trauma-informed perspective and approach to meeting the youth where they're at. And I think, you know, a lot about harm reduction in that, and how important that is, and how crucial trauma-informed care is to adopting harm reduction tactics when you're working with homeless youth specifically.
So next, I just wanted to ask that a lot of people know homelessness as people on the street. And I know we talked about this a little before, but I know homelessness can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. So what are other ways homelessness could look that people may not be aware of?
I can start us off. And I guess, you know, I can only share this from my own personal experience, you know, around 2018, you know, is when I went into homelessness. And I had aged out of the system not too long ago from that, and went into what we call young adult voluntary foster care, which is extended foster care from 18 to 21. But unfortunately, due to institutionalization and a lot of stuff manifesting within mental health and self-care for myself, I did not build a support, you know. So when things happened in my life, I got in a car accident, and you know, that took away from me getting to work. You know, I didn't have any other person to depend on, you know. So I had some associates and some acquaintances that stepped up and like, hey, let's stay together, you know. But come to find out, you know, staying with friends can either go really great or it could go bad. And it went really south. And I ended up leaving for safety reasons, and staying on the street. I remember staying in a park. I remember staying in a car, and then eventually connecting with a coordinator for this program called MYY, which is Michigan Youth Opportunity Initiative. She connected me with a Christian shelter. I stayed in that shelter for 6 months. While being in that shelter, it was a lot that I had to realize, you know. But when I mentioned earlier, you know, homelessness looked like different things, because eventually I went from literally not having anything, getting kicked out of my own apartment, being evicted, to couch surfing, technically staying with a friend, you know, to literally staying on the street, being that person on the bench that you walk past, to being in a homeless shelter. So when I mentioned earlier, it can literally look like different things, and it's really meant for that individual to determine, you know. That's what I was referring to. But ultimately, throughout my time of being homelessness, I didn't stop advocating. You know, I worked 3 jobs. You know, I worked as a student life assistant. I worked as the mascot for my college because they gave me a scholarship. And I worked as a clerical assistant, and I did that to work my way out of the shelter, and so forth. But I remember advocating and applying for NFYI Shadow Day in the midst of this, and I wasn't going to do any of that. But a couple advocates, a couple of friends of mine in the alumni community of foster care reached out to me and was like, you know, you have to, because you have a story to tell about what you're going through, you know. And I ended up doing that and sharing my experience. But not a lot of people knew, you know, I was homeless. I even had some people, I would sleep in the room with them. Like, it's this big room, we all have bunk beds, but sleep in a room with them and so forth. would leave and go to class in the morning, and we'll walk past some of the people I was technically roommating with, and the guy came up to me asking me for $1. And I looked at him like, "You remember me?" And he was like, "No," and I gave him $1, and I was like, "I was staying right next to you," and it just shows, how consciously I got up, I dressed up, I got ready for college, got ready for class, and I kept it moving. I was homeless for 6 months in the shelter, but I was in a state of homelessness from 2018 to 2021. Like, I couldn't find stability. My life always was hanging on that edge of, if you lose this spot, you're gonna be in your car. You lose your car, you're gonna be on the street. And we don't realize how that's a lot of people today. If they literally don't get paid from their job, they're gonna be out the next month and so forth. So that's a little bit I wanted to share on the personal side. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing that. That's such a such an empowering narrative that you shared there, and thank you so much. I wanted to touch on a little bit of what you already mentioned slightly, but again, in my day-to-day life, I work a lot with shelter youth. So I think we think about homelessness, as you mentioned, Reem, we think about homelessness as people sleeping in tents on the side, on the side of the road, and kind of camping outside. And, that is definitely one phase of homelessness that we see and we work with. But I think sometimes we forget about the youth that are able to stay in the shelter. Specifically at Urban Peak, we house youth between the ages of 14 to 21. So we have a wide, range of youth that we work with, and shelter life is really different. It's really a difficult place for youth to be. It's not always the best, but it's often the best option that they have available. It's not always, ideal, but can feel very institutional, I will say. So, we try not to have it feel that institutional, but it is definitely an institution. And in that same vein, though, it can be very comfortable, so if you're coming from being on the streets or, couch surfing constantly, and moving all the time, being in one place at the shelter can be very comfortable. Oh, it looks like we lost Michael. Hopefully he'll come back, but it can be very comfortable living in the shelter. You get 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which is great. We help with employment services. We can help with education. We have a lot of youth that, work jobs from the shelter. And I think, it's funny, this narrative of the societal narrative of, well, just get a job, right? And I think people don't realize how unbelievably taxing it is to have a job and to work while you're homeless. It's so much more difficult than waking up every day in your own house, your own apartment, driving your car to your job and driving back. When you're homeless, where are you going to keep your stuff during the day? How are you going to get to work? Do you have a place to leave your stuff for the day? Is it somewhere you can trust? Is it with someone you can trust? All these things that, you don't have to think about if you're not in that position. So I think people don't quite understand how difficult it is to hold a job consistently while you're homeless. But, living at the shelter is often a safer, bet than other locations. At least at, at Urban Peak, it's fairly small. We only have about 30 beds in our shelter currently. We're working on expanding at the moment, but that's kind of what we got. So smaller numbers means it's a little bit safer. We can keep an eye on everybody. And shelter life can be a good place to be. It is often the best option available, as I was saying, but again, it's not ideal, but it can be the best option. So yeah, the other thing with Urban Peak, if you are staying in a shelter, you can hopefully get case management to work towards housing. That's another service, at least, that we offer. So shelter life is definitely the best, but not ideal.
Yeah, so another question is that, are there any systems in place that we have in society today that can cause people to be at a higher risk for homelessness?
I'd love to take that just quickly, if possible. So at least with our population, and I think with the homeless population in general, the big statistic that we like to talk about is that 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. So I don't necessarily want to call it a risk factor because I think that sounds strange, but definitely we work with a lot of LGBTQ youth. That is a huge subset of the youth that we work with. We are incredibly conscious, at least at Urban Peak, of pronouns and things like that. All of our forums, we ask people to specify their pronouns, how they identify, things like that, because we try to be respectful of everybody's chosen identity. But that is definitely one of the biggest things that we see for youth, especially on the younger side. Are youth that are LGBTQ and that have had difficulty finding or keeping a place or a home because of that and because of their chosen identities. So definitely want to make sure I get that out there.
Yeah, I would just, add, statistics show like 31 to 46% of people who have experience in foster care will experience some sort of homelessness. And we can argue and say there's many different variations, but I'm a big person when it comes to understanding the side effects, or I like to call them side effects of experiencing, foster care. It can all trickle down to mental health, and the approach or taking care of, exiting out of care, especially if you've been in congregate care throughout your whole duration for an extended time, can be really hard. It can really resemble, a veteran coming home from war, or a prisoner exiting prison. So you've been told what to do for years, and now you're put out into this big old world and expected, to have it all together. And there's no room for mistakes or mess ups. And a lot of people fumble the bag, and no fault of their own, but to no real guidance or support or transition into that, and we have a lot of programs to try to combat it, but a lot of our people in care don't have great experiences. So when you get to those older ages of transitioning out, before actually transitioning out, it's for some of those youth, not all, a lot of them experience, I don't want nothing else to do, with the system or anything, so unfortunately, with making that decision within themselves, they're already turning away support, that they more than likely will need. And when they exit out and when they're facing that rough spot, because it was me, was too prideful to ask for help because we've burned those bridges, or we ask for help when it's really too late, or so forth. So there's a lot of different contributing factors, but I think, having, access to mental health, having proper self-care tools and tips and so forth, and actually having a variety of different things in your transition plan before exiting out can alleviate it. But ultimately, there's so many different things that come at youth: human trafficking, depression, substance use, all these different things, all these different factors when a person ages out with no real secure housing. Unfortunately, we see side effects of things that can be detrimental.
So, kind of going off of what Michael was talking about, are there any other roles mental health can take in terms of youth homelessness?
If that starts off. Um, so in my work, I'm finding as I continue to grow in my knowledge, because I've never stopped learning. I've learned that in this field, continue to learn. I'm learning more and more people have been misdiagnosed in the foster care system. And a lot of those misdiagnoses can boil down to three different things, which one is RAD, and I'm drawing a blank on the the actual. I believe it's reactive. I'm drawing a blank, but if you know what it is, you know what I'm talking about. But one is RAD, one is PTSD, and one is institutionalization. A lot of those end up being labeled as ADHD, bipolar, or what have you. You know, so a lot of people end up coming out of the system not wanting to take any meds, not wanting nothing to do with any kind of mental health care or what have you. And one, it's not healthy to just go cold turkey off of any medication that you've been taking for a long time. And two, not, not looking at mental health as always just something, well, they're just trying to get me on meds. There's therapy, there's so many different aspects to mental health. It isn't just the medication piece, and the lack of understanding of the holistic view of mental health, the lack of information because of the bad experiences, which are completely valid. We're seeing a lot of people have stigmas against mental health, especially in the foster care sense. And as a person with lived experience who have taken on that approach and has been misdiagnosed myself, I try to use my lived experience and my knowledge to help combat on a peer support and mentoring sense. But I'm only one person, and it's hard to combat it all. But I think we all have a duty in this sense of child welfare, to be able to break down, and it doesn't even have to do with just foster care, but breaking down the stigmas around mental health culturally and society-wise, to be able to see better outcomes and meet people more approachable to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% agree with that. I think one of the biggest things is really trying to break down the stigma around it. Often people think of, oh, somebody's homeless, they must either, be on drugs or they're crazy, right? And I think that goes back to looking at things with a trauma-informed care perspective. Because if you're coming at things with a trauma-informed perspective, things like mental health are less of a barrier. We chat with youth I talk with youth all the time that are somewhat unstable, and sometimes they're the best conversations I have all day, to be honest. You just have to be able to really chat with the youth and just meet them where they're at and see what they're going through and see what you can offer them in the state that they're at. Sometimes it is really challenging too. Mental health presents a huge challenge for working with youth. I can give you the example of one youth that I've worked with throughout, my time being at Urban Peak. And we recently moved our shelter from one location to another, which was a huge shift for the youth. And a lot of youth experienced some trauma around that move, understandably, with their past experiences. And we had one youth that was very, very stable at the old shelter, was taking their meds, consistently every day, had been diagnosed with some mental health issues. And, during the move from the one shelter to the other, became slightly dysregulated and began refusing to take their meds. And it got so bad to the point where we could no longer serve them and we could no longer offer them services just for the safety of the other youth. And it's really heartbreaking because you feel like you're letting one youth down in trying to help, the 50 other youth that are there present, that you're trying to, keep safe and kind of make sure that they maintain some sort of normalcy and regulation. And that's one that really sticks with me. And it's one that I think about all the time with mental health. And, it's not always meds, as Michael mentioned, meds are not always the answer, but they can be huge. And maintaining meds, if you need them, can be a huge challenge when you're homeless. Maintaining meds can be a challenge for regular adults, so imagine maintaining meds as not only as a youth, but as a homeless youth. Where are you going to refill your prescriptions? Where are you going to maintain your care? Are you seeing a psychiatrist or a therapist regularly? All these things are huge challenges that, at Urban Peak, we still wrestle with a ton. And it's heartbreaking sometimes to see those youth where the mental health piece is so out of control or so past the point of you being able to help that, you know, you kind of have to sort of lend them off and pass them along to somebody else. And it's heartbreaking. But I would say mental health is definitely one of the biggest challenges for sure in working with homeless youth.
So in terms of working towards a solution, what is the government's role in mitigating homelessness?
I laughed a little bit because the obvious answer to me is just money. Money, money, money. So, you know, one cool thing that they're doing here in Denver, at least, is we have the Denver Basic Income Project, which is just starting up. It's a universal income program that they're piloting here. We were lucky enough to be one of the central organizations that they targeted. So a lot of our youth have been able to sign up and participate in that. They're getting I think it's between $50 and $1,000 a month, depending on kind of like what group you fall into. And so I think this idea of directly paying youth is huge. Directly paying homeless people is enormous. The biggest reason that most people are homeless is because of money, because they don't have enough, and they don't have enough to be able to maintain living and having a place to stay. So money is huge. There are other things as well. You know, obviously we spoke a little bit earlier about the McKinney-Vento stuff, at least for education, that has been enormous. So ensuring that there are these protections for homeless youth, I think, is key. You know, making sure that schools or other institutions abide by those regulations is also key. So being able to take it to them and say, hey, this is the law, this is the legislation, that has been huge. So that will be my 2 cents, and hopefully they will listen to me and start paying everybody more money.
There's multiple different solutions that we can spend all night going. But one thing I would say, the first step to getting to the solution is acknowledgement. I can speak on so many different variations of homelessness because I've experienced it within being in the child welfare realm of things, after being in child welfare realm of things, even prior to being in child welfare, you know. But in the essence of what I do in my work, I'm going to speak to the foster care side of things. And it feels as though for many youth exiting out, as though they spent all this time in an imperfect system that may have caused them more trauma, and then don't have no support in the back end. You know, no guidance, no true lane of success. And in some states, you know, it's all right, you've been through child welfare and what have you, but when you exit, it's so unaffordable for housing, you have no choice but homelessness. But you didn't ask to be removed, even though it probably was in the best interest, you know, but now you're removed and they could not find you anywhere to stay. So you stayed in congregate care, or you were in a foster home until they say, well, you're 18, you have to leave now. And unfortunately, you barely made it past high school, you know, so getting a university dorm is out of the question. You know, where do you go? Where do you go? You know, and it almost feels as though we blame people for just life happening to them, and we need to stop doing that as a society in order to get to the solution. And I think the biggest way is by acknowledging, then bringing equity into these communities. You know, we know where the problems lie. We know, we have all the statistics and all the stats around how many people, you know, from minority neighborhoods end up in homeless, how many people with who've been in child welfare or have experienced foster care end up homeless. We know the stats between how many people in the LGBTQ community end up homeless. So we can specifically target programs that provide equity and housing to these specific communities. But some reason we don't. I think of child welfare. Child welfare is a $1 billion industry, you know, and for me, I understand it, I get it. But I can't help but to think, you know, as a society where we pride ourselves on helping humanity, When do we bring humanity back in our own country, in our own state, and in our own city? Being able to provide housing and so forth. I remember this might be my last piece. I remember going to DC, and we took a tour or what have you. I was so happy being a Black American going to DC. Like, it was the all beats all for me because I'm from Detroit. I'm like, I didn't see myself ever making it. And I made it, with selection of being a part of NFY Shadow Day. But one thing that stuck out to me about Shadow Day was down the street from the Capitol was a homeless shelter with people lined up outside of the homeless shelter, sleeping outside of it. And that imprinted in my brain because I'm like, this is where the money is being given and divvied up and what have you. How are they outside? They can't. The government can't just pay a hotel to get them some more room. Like, I don't know. I'm just, it all boils down to funding. There's no all beats answer. But one thing we can say, funding is at the root of it. And by providing equity, by providing resources, by providing, more resources into families, being able to pass on legacy so they're not kicked out of their homes, more people to be able to have and own homes, and what have you, we can see a better future. We can see less homelessness.
So last question before we move on to our Q&A. What can we as youth and as activists do to help homeless youth?
I mean, one great thing is to, honestly, to volunteer. If you can, if you have the time, if you have the resources, I know, here, at least at Urban Peak in Denver, we are always looking for volunteers. There's so many different ways you can volunteer. I mean, you can help out in the kitchen cooking, you can help out tutoring if you have that sort of knowledge, you can mentor somebody in like a new skill, you can run an art program or an art class. Like, there's so many different ways that people can get involved and volunteer, because I think also when you have that direct experience and that direct interaction between yourself and the youth, it builds so much connection and understanding. Even myself, before I took this job, going in, I was a little nervous. Going into a homeless youth shelter is it can be a little bit scary. And I definitely will say that after a few days, literally 3-4 days, I felt right at home. All the youth are perfectly normal and perfectly amazing in their own way. And I think getting in there and having that direct experience is so cool and so key. So I always recommend, if you have the time and the capacity to be able to do that, I always recommend checking out, somewhere local that you might be able to help out and volunteer. You could even do, voter registration. There's so many different ways to get involved, So I would absolutely, if you have the time and the capacity, volunteering is a great way to help out. Yeah.
Definitely. One thing I will add is, become more informed, do your research, I think a lot of us in society, we just don't know. So we don't do because we just don't know, so I think by really, doing your research, looking at the statistics behind it, but also not just taking the statistics for what they are, just being real, looking more into that and, seeing what you can do in your own community. A lot of what I do is local and national and statewide advocacy, around homelessness and so forth, so if that is something that you're interested in, do a lot more research, people are more than willing to connect with me. I can share my information, but there's a lot of organizations, surrounding foster care, homelessness, think of us, NFYI, Foster Club, that have a lot of different information where you can visit their websites and check out, and so forth, on opportunities to advocate and speak to congressional leaders about different policies and legislation that needs to pass to be able to provide better housing. But one thing I would challenge, you all listening is to see what's going on in your own community, because I promise you, you will be surprised by what, homelessness looks like in your own backyard.
Thank you both. So we have time for a couple of questions. So if anyone in the audience wants to send some for any of our panelists to answer, we have time for a couple of those. One question I see is, has the pandemic impacted youth homelessness in your experience?
As I started off, yes, definitely, and I can speak more specifically for some of the older youth, people who have aged out or people getting ready to age out, or so forth. But some people that were getting ready to age out didn't age out. They extended it, to just help them out, but before that was even extended, people did age out into homeless situations, unfortunately, but also for the people who have recently aged out, before COVID even arrived, they aged out, and just understanding that some of those people didn't have careers, so without a solid career or a solid cushion, they lost their housing, because we have to realize during the pandemic, it took a while before they put a rental freeze in. It took a while before DHS, or I don't know what it's called in Colorado. So help me out, but it's called DHS here. To implement all these different extensions and changes. So there was a lot of people who fell through the gap. I know a lot of alumni who recently just moved into college had got kicked out of their dorm, to come to find out after the pandemic that they could have stayed in their dorm, so it's a lot, and a lot of people are still facing those repercussions and still trying to catch up on rent and payments, so it's still affecting today, and unfortunately we have been able to get a stimulus of some sort for aged out youth and youth in care through Chafee funding. But in the state of Michigan, our Chafee funding didn't really get released, and I remember advocating specifically, talking to newspapers and so forth to get this released, but our Chafee funding didn't get released in time, so we missed out on some of the services that could have been provided. But we only received like $1,000 when the pandemic lasted a little bit over a year or so, and $1,000 is one month's rent for some people. So
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that I haven't had this job long enough to be able to see the change from pre-pandemic to during pandemic. I started just right in the middle of the pandemic. So I haven't been able to see sort of the difference, but I will say one thing that I do worry about personally with the pandemic is just the extent of COVID in the homeless population, and the extent of COVID, especially within, the homeless youth population, I think is so astronomical. Going back to, harm reduction, a lot of our youth do use drugs, and a lot of times they are sharing pipes or snorters or whatever it is, or needles, and so the rate of COVID is just huge amongst the homeless population. And I think that I personally worry about the effects that that's going to have long term on our youth. I think I've personally seen tons of our youth, at least in the shelter, get COVID, and I've seen COVID go through the shelter, and I really worry about the long-term health impacts that it's going to have on our youth. For sure. That's something that I definitely keeps me up at night sometimes. So.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this webinar today, but I want to give a huge thank you to both of our panelists as well as Austin, who had to leave earlier. So thank you both for coming and sharing all of your stories and your knowledge. If you could drop your info in the chat so anyone from the audience could reach out to you with any more questions, that would be great. But that concludes our webinar for today. So thank you all for attending.